have believed in the last years of the 19th century that this world was being watched, keenly and closely, by intelligences greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. That as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacency, men went to and fro over this globe, about their little affairs, serene in the assurance of their empire over matter. Yet across the gulf of space, minds that are to our minds as ours are to those of the beasts that perish, intellects vast and cool and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes, and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. The War of the Worlds may be the most widely read science fiction story ever written. It was first published in 1897 as a serial in Pearson's magazine, and in book form in 1898. It has not been out of print since then, with new editions appearing regularly on bookshelves around the world. And it has inspired some dramatic variations on the theme.
A bulletin is handed me. Martian cylinders are falling all over the country.
40 years after The War of the Worlds was published, that radio play from the novel terrified thousands of Americans. And movies made from this and other books by Wells reached an even wider audience. He inspired a whole new category of fiction: science fiction. Wells and later writers in the genre aroused several generations to think about the future and look towards the stars. Today's space program owes them all a debt. Wells was not the first to imagine life from other planets, but the realism with which he described his Martians made it seem that way.
It had, for me, the kind of quality that I think later Spielberg and Lucas picked up in some of their work. The giant machines, which felt to me in reading very awkward. And I found it primitive in that respect, but at the same time awesome. Maybe for the very same reason, because they were so clunky, mechanical, and yet were able to function.
The novel follows a hero as he evades death at the hands of those invading creatures. The hero, who is never named, watches as they destroy his land, his countrymen, his world. These superior beings, behaving much as man has behaved, begin their remorseless massacre of civilization. For the most part, Wells based his stories on what science knew or thought it knew at the time. His dark vision was that just as man is mortal, so too is humanity. The danger may come from space or here on Earth. In either case, our safety on this globe is not assured. Wells feared a kind of golden rule operating in nature. He warned that we may suffer the same fate to which we have consigned other species: extinction. Hope, if any, lies in unity and scientific knowledge. The story begins with a sign in the heavens.
Hundreds of observers saw the flame that night and the night after about midnight, and again the night after, and so for 10 nights, a flame each night. Then came the night of the first falling star. It was seen early in the morning, rushing over Winchester eastward, a line of flame high in the atmosphere. Hundreds must have seen it and taken it for an ordinary falling star.
"30 miles from London, near the town of Woking, a great cylinder crashes to the ground. A crowd gathers as a hatch opens, revealing creatures which look like huge brains with eyes and mouths and tentacles for limbs.
I noted a little black knot of men, the foremost of whom was waving a white flag. This was the deputation. There had been a hasty consultation, and since the Martians were evidently, in spite of their repulsive forms, intelligent creatures, it had been resolved to show them, by approaching them with signals, that we too were intelligent. Slowly, a humped shape rose out of the pit, and the ghost of a beam of light seemed to flicker out from it.
The slaughter begins. As the townspeople scatter for their very lives, the Martian's fantastic weapon, a kind of heat ray, swings about, firing at everything that moves, until nothing moves anymore.
Suddenly, like a thing falling upon me from without, came fear. I ran, weeping silently, as a child might do.
As night falls, the Martians assemble several monster machines. Each machine is manned by a Martian brain. They begin to burn and blast their way through Woking and other towns in the direction of London. The army attacks them with its biggest guns, but it is no use. It seems clear now that all humanity is doomed.
War of the Worlds could be read, and was read, as being a parable about the possible German invasion of England. I think some other people thought of it as perhaps the British Empire was coming to an end, the frontier had closed off in North America. Where's the next frontier? It's going to be in outer space, but what if somebody is already there?
There was a kind of sadness in the gay 90s. A sense of endings was in the air. End of the century, end of Victorian England. The old was dying, but the new was being born, and it was an exciting time to be alive, especially if you were young and brilliant and in London. And the young H.G. was all of that, and he seems to have copied the contradictions of the age onto his very soul.
He was a socialist, and yet he wasn't a socialist. He hated privilege, and yet he loved hobnobbing with the rich.
He was from the very lowest edge of the middle class, semi-professional class, so that he was conscious of the problem of slipping down into the working class, but at the same time hopeful that he could rise in the class he was in.
H.G. Wells was born in 1866 in Bromley, Kent. His mother was a maid, and his father a shopkeeper. No literary influence there. In fact, his career owed a lot to a childhood accident. He broke his leg.
He, at 8 years old, with a broken leg, sitting on the couch for about 4.5 months, read every single day of his life, all that time. And it was that reading and the breadth of the reading and the scientific nature of some of it that I think drove him in the way he was going. He began writing little stories when he was about 8 or 9 years old. And in fact, 1 or 2 of them still exist. They were strip cartoons with a text. One called The Desert Daisy has been reproduced since his death by the University of Illinois.
In school, young Herbert George was recognized as extremely bright, and he won a scholarship to the Normal School of Science in London. He taught biology, briefly, but writing was his passion.
From the time he started writing, he continued to write in one form or another throughout. Much of the stuff is not published or publishable, but he's working on the time machine by the time he's 18 and writing fairly seriously in about science and education right from the beginning.
Wells produced an enormous volume of work in his lifetime. 156 books of fiction, philosophical essays, and political tracts, and countless articles. He wrote more words than Shakespeare and Dickens combined. Now, the quality of this output was uneven, but even in his less successful works, Wells showed a unique power of vision. He could see the likely results of scientific findings and new technologies decades into the future. In 1902, he saw the coming of the suburbs and long-distance commuting, and he predicted new kinds of warfare.
Ironclad road fighting machines may perhaps play a considerable part. Aeroplanes will sweep down upon the adversary's rear and will drop explosives and incendiary matters upon them.
At the turn of the century, the War of the Worlds captivated a reading public already fascinated by the promise and dangers of science, and by the implications of one scientific theory in particular, evolution. Wells shared and exploited the unease Darwin's theory had created. His Martians, in fact, were evolution's product.
We men are just in the beginning of the evolution that the Martians have worked out. They have become practically mere brains, wearing bodies according to their needs, just as men wear suits of clothes and take a bicycle in a hurry or an umbrella in the wet.
Wells doesn't take sides between the Londoners and the Martians, because part of his marvelous argument is that in time we might evolve to be like the Martians. The Martians, he says, owing to the conditions that they endure on Mars, have evolved from creatures much like us. And after the description of how horrible the Martians are, this is what you get to learn, that it could be us.
Or it could be the end of us.
Wells is very heavily influenced by Darwin. Wells believed that human beings, Homo sapiens, in the 1890s were at the apex of their rule of the world, and very probably would be thrown down by some other species to come.
Evolution was a theory widely misused then and later. It seemed to justify everything from colonialism to ideas of supermen and master races. Natural selection became survival of the fittest, which in turn became survival of the strongest, most cruel and ruthless. There was a dark side to evolutionary theory which also cast its shadow on H.G. Wells.
Wells wrote a lot that was wrong and that was bad. He did a lot that was wrong and that was bad. He said a lot that was wrong and was bad, and it hasn't been recorded in previous biographies.
Michael Coren's book is a critical biography in the harshest sense of that word. One might even call it attack biography. Coren is not fond of his subject.
I was trying to put the record straight. As a writer, he was a social engineer, so he put forward views and ideas that didn't make the Holocaust possible, didn't make the Khmer Rouge or Mao or Stalin possible, but it gave a sort of intellectual veneer to those ideas.
In 1902, Wells published a book of predictions entitled Anticipations. That book showed his gift as a prophet. It also embodied those contradictions in his character that prompt debate to this day. Writing in the final chapter of Anticipations, he predicts a new elite of engineers and scientists who will administer a new utopia, encourage the procreation of what is fine and efficient and beautiful in humanity, and weed out undesirable types.
And the method that nature has followed hitherto in the shaping of the world, whereby weakness was prevented from propagating weakness, the method that must in some cases still be called in to the help of man, is death, the merciful obliteration of weak and silly and pointless things.
That's what Wells's critics mean when they call him a social engineer. The cool, even cold detachment with which he mused about obliterating weak and silly and pointless things can be read dismayingly as a precursor to the insane experiments in social engineering that would scar the 20th century. Wells has also been accused of racism and anti-Semitism, partly on the basis of the new society he described in Anticipations.
And as Wells said, for example, as for the dark and swarthy and yellow people, I take it they will have to go. Or the Jews are termites in the civilized world, I take it they will have to go.
That's not entirely fair. This is what Wells actually wrote.
And how will the new republic treat the inferior races? How will it deal with the black, the yellow man? How will it tackle that alleged termite in the civilized woodwork, the Jew? Certainly not as races at all. Whatever men come into its efficient citizenship, it will let come.
While the logic of those sentences are anti-racist, there is, however, a racist tone to his language.
And for the rest, those swarms of black and brown and dirty white and yellow people who do not come into the new needs of efficiency, I take it they will have to go.
And yet in the same book, Wells also argued forcefully against the racist idea, and he denounced the twisting of Darwinian theory.
The worldwide repudiation of slavery in the 19th century was done against a vast sullen force of ignorant pride, which, reinvigorated by the new delusions, swings back again to power.
As a rising young literary star, Wells was invited to join the Fabian Society, a socialist group which included playwright George Bernard Shaw and other intellectuals of the day. But Wells was a socialist full of contradictions. He didn't have much use for the masses. He hated trade unions. He was a child of the lower middle classes who was terrified of the lower classes. He strongly supported the Bolshevik Revolution, but unlike so many others on the left, he was revolted by Stalin's repressions.
Yes, he went and saw Stalin. He was much more critical of the Stalin regime than almost any of the other leading critics from the left in this country, certainly much more than Bernard Shaw and Sidney Webb, who went there and wrote highly favorable views about Stalin.
Michael Foot, the former leader of Britain's Labour Party, knew Wells personally and is pained by suggestions that he supported social engineering, Soviet style.
Indeed, when he went to see Lenin, Lenin denounced him ferociously as a ridiculous little bourgeois or something of that sort. But of course, what Wells wrote about Russia in the shadows at that time, considering at the moment when it was written, it was I don't say a fully prophetic book, and some things that he said were right and some things that were wrong, but what he said were the genuine judgments of a liberal mind
a satirical aside in the philosophical fantasy, A Modern Utopia, foresaw in 1905 the genocide practiced by the Nazis. Furthermore, this man, accused of racism and social engineering, also was a lifelong libertarian and the principal author of an idea called the Universal Rights of Man, that later was enshrined as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
It came from the War Aims campaign of 1939. It had been translated into about 40 or 50 languages and circulated around the world for commentary. Wells thought this should be part of the United Nations organization, and Eleanor Roosevelt proposed it in a modified form, somewhat modified, not much, and it was adopted and is part of the Charter, the Universal Declaration, which was Wells's originally, is part of the UN Charter.
Wells's many books and articles, his ideas about the future, and the accuracy of many of his predictions brought him prominence beyond the fame of popular authors. He became a kind of international guru, consulted by great personages. He met with the likes of Lloyd George, Henry Ford, Franklin Roosevelt, and Shirley Temple.
This is why he's difficult to classify, because he became, depending how you look at it, much more or much less than a writer. He became a world figure.
Wells believed passionately in the idea of one world and one world government. For years he preached his vision of a global society at peace, where distinctions of race and class will give way to those of merit. During World War II, he proposed that the emerging victors, America, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain, work together to enforce global peace.
If they took possession of the air, as they are quite capable of doing, nothing could withstand them. They could take the air out of politics, out of international affairs, and lay the foundations for a world peace that would endure forever.
That wasn't quite what happened, of course. Wells's fellow human beings seemed as ill-suited to peaceful cooperation as his fictional Martians, and they had come to conquer. During the Martian invasion, the hero figures the safest place to be is in the aliens' ruined wake. He follows their machines toward London, passing through miles of devastation on the way. He meets another survivor, the curate of a local church, and they continue together. The two men take shelter for the night in a deserted house. Suddenly the house caves in, hit by the crash landing of a Martian spaceship. The two men survive, but are trapped, and through an opening in a crushed wall, they witness the Martians' dietary habits.
They did not eat, much less digest. They took the fresh, living blood of other creatures and injected it into their own veins. I cannot bring myself to describe what I could not endure even to continue watching. The bare idea of this is no doubt horribly repulsive to us, but at the same time I think that we should remember how repulsive our carnivorous habits would seem to an intelligent rabbit.
The men notice a strange red weed growing beyond the wall. Apparently something the Martians brought with them. Trapped for 2 weeks in that ruined house, they begin to learn more about this new species come to dominate the future. The Martians do not sleep, and so they are able to work round the clock. And they do not know what illness is, there having been no microorganisms on Mars.
In the next place, under as it seems in a sexual world, Martians were absolutely without sex. and therefore without any of the tumultuous emotions that arise from that difference among men.
The author of those words was quite familiar with tumultuous emotions. If many Victorians were inhibited about sex, H.G. Wells was not one of them. He challenged that starched convention with, so to speak, a passion.
Wells certainly did know a lot of women. It was one of the things that writing and success brought him. And what's more, women liked him very much, and after they had been his lovers, they often remained his friends. They said he smelt of honey.
H.G. Wells explored his sexual urges with a legendary number of women, wives, lovers, friends, and flings. He later explained his insatiable appetite as a search for his lover shadow. It began with his cousin Isabel. He married her, but Isabel quickly proved sexually and intellectually disappointing.
A second person came into Wells's life, and this is the woman we know as Jane, or Amy Catherine Robbins, as she was, her real name was. She was a student in Wells's laboratory.
So Wells divorced Isabel, married Amy, whom he inexplicably insisted on calling Jane, and went to work. From 1895 to 1898, he wrote frantically, launching his writing career with 3 of his most famous novels: The Time Machine, The War of the Worlds, and The Island of Dr. Moreau. Married Bliss, however, soon wore thin, and Wells began chasing shadows again. By all accounts, Jane knew of his affairs and accepted them.
There's one occasion when 2 mistresses, 2 rival mistresses, went to see H.G. Wells' wife and said, "I want to be your husband's lover. No, I want to be your husband's lover." And she had to judge, Solomon-like if you like, who would be her husband's lover.
It was a turn-of-the-century soap opera. Was this man, who loved so many women, a feminist or a rogue, a free spirit or a rake? A number of his lovers were impressive, dynamic women. They admired him, they bore him children, they kept in touch with him long after their affairs ended. The most important of these was the novelist Rebecca West. The 2 loved and quarreled for 10 years.
Wells once shouted out, "You're too ugly to meet my friends." He treated her in the most appalling way. When they had a child, he refused to see the child and just packed Rebecca and the little boy off to the countryside.
But she also, the day after he died, wrote to his daughter-in-law and said, "You and I both know that I loved him every day of my life."
But sexual gratification and emotional commitment appeared to be 2 more worlds at war within this man. In the War of the Worlds, more than people and buildings are destroyed. Institutions, too, are leveled. Organized religion takes a direct hit through the person of the curate. Under severe stress, the curate loses his nerve and finally his mind. He begins to rant loudly, forcing on the hero a grim necessity.
The curate is the weakest of the weak. He gives in. The narrator has to kill him, in fact, because he's going to reveal all to the fighting machines. And the curate is a person who, first of all, tries to rely on God and then finds that fails him. And so he doesn't have anything to rely on except run around. He's the epitome of the rabbit, in fact, in the metaphor.
On the 15th day of his imprisonment, the narrator wakes up and discovers, to his astonishment, that the Martians are gone. He steps out of the shattered house and gazes across a landscape empty except for the Martians' red weed, which seems to be everywhere.
I felt the first inkling of a thing that presently grew quite clear in my mind. that oppressed me for many days, a sense of dethronement, a persuasion that I was no longer a master, but an animal among animals, under the Martian heel. With us it would be as with them, to lurk and watch, to run and hide. The fear and empire of man had passed away.
Alone now, the narrator resumes his grim journey toward London. As he passes the fearful leavings of the Martians, a thought of guilty recognition seizes him.
We must remember what ruthless and utter destruction our own species has wrought, not only upon animals, but upon its inferior races. The Tasmanians, in spite of their human likeness, were entirely swept out of existence in a war of extermination waged by European immigrants. Are we such apostles of mercy as to complain if the Martians war in the same spirit?
So the Martian invasion was a cautionary tale in the spirit of what goes around comes around. The idea of intelligent beings on Mars was taken seriously by many people back then, including H.G. Wells.
He'd written about Mars a couple of times earlier and went summarizing the knowledge. But in addition, this was a time period when a great many people in England are interested in visitors from outer space, the possibility of visitors from outer space.
In 1877, the Italian astronomer Giovanni Schiaparelli saw what he took to be waterways on Mars. He called them canali, which is Italian for channels. The word was mistranslated, however, to read canals.
When people began to see these illusionary lines, then this was in a period of time when all over the world people were building canals and great works of irrigation. And so it was an easy next step to say, well, these great canals were to save that Martian world. So again, imagination took over and built much of that structure. But nevertheless, that was the popular scientific understanding at the time H.G. Wells wrote.
And long after that time, Wells's story of invading Martians still had the power to shock. On the night of October 30th, 1938, several million American radio listeners were tuned to CBS when the Halloween broadcast of the Mercury Theater of the Air came on. Many who tuned in a little late missed the introduction and may have caught this.
Ladies and gentlemen, here is the latest bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. Professor Morse of Macmillan University reports observing a total of 3 explosions on the planet Mars between the hours of 7:45 p.m. and 9:20 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
The story unfolded in the form of a series of special radio bulletins. Thousands believed they were hearing live news. Radio actors provided them with details of ultimate disaster.
It is reported that at 8:50 p.m. a huge flaming object fell on a farm in the neighborhood of Grover's Mill, New Jersey, 22 miles from Trenton.
Woking had been replaced by Grover's Mill, London by New York, but the basic plot was the same.
The monster is now in control of the middle section of New Jersey and has effectively cut the state through its center. Communication lines are down from Pennsylvania to the Atlantic Ocean. Highways are clogged with frantic human traffic. Police and army reserves are unable to control the mad flight.
As the radio conjured up images of panic in the minds of listeners, some listeners actually did panic and fled.
The enemy is now in sight above the Palisades. 5 great machines. First one is crossing the river. I can see it from here, wading the Hudson like a man wading through a brook.
2X2L calling CQ. Isn't there anyone on the air? Isn't there anyone on the air? Isn't there anyone?
Howard Koch remembers that night, as well he should. He wrote the script, did it in a 6-day and night marathon, then got a full night's sleep. The next morning, as he walked down 72nd Street to get a haircut, he learned what he and his producer had done.
I heard war, panic, so on. And I went into the barber shop and I said, "Are we at war or something?" And he laughed and he held up a newspaper with a headline, "Martian broadcast Panic's Nation. Well, that was one of the strangest moments in my life.
But the real heat was on the very young and beleaguered producer, whose name happened to be Welles also. Orson Welles.
It came rather as a great surprise to us that a story, the fine H.G. Wells classic fantasy, the original for so many succeeding comic strips and adventure stories and novels, about a mythical invasion by monsters from the planet Mars, should have had so profound an effect upon radio listeners.
Howard Koch went on to write screenplays for such movie greats as Casablanca. But he has never forgotten Halloween 1938. Perhaps War of the Worlds will always strike a chord. In 1943, a young British soldier on his way to the front found Wells's creation still powerfully appropriate.
I was on a mainline station, and there, selling in hardcover, was H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, with the deadly machines of the Martians striding across the cover, searchlights waving, even as that night they waved over London. Ah, God, this was a topical novel, you know. It was the most topical novel you could read at that time. And then it had been written, what? It was 50 years old then.
Menacing all mankind and every creature on earth comes the War of the Worlds.
In 1953, Hollywood tried its hand at adapting War of the Worlds. The movie unveiled startling new special effects. The adaptation might have caused poor H.G. to groan in his grave. The story was given a kind of religious overlay and updated once again. The Martians had learned to fly. The narrator got a name and a love interest.
Oh, Uncle Matthew, this is Dr. Clayton Forrester. My uncle, Dr. Matthew Collins, pastor of the community church.
Well...
The curate was a minister who, trying to communicate, became a martyr, which conveniently left his niece to get trapped with the narrator in the house caved in by the new arrival. The Martians did come to the same end as in the book, almost.
We were all praying for a miracle.
It's just that this time, it was an act of God. Mars, the red planet. It still intrigues us. Of course, we can relax about a Martian invasion. We've been taking close-up pictures of Mars since 1965, and we haven't spotted a launching pad yet. In the last 3 decades, Mars has been extensively studied by NASA spacecraft. From Mariner 9 in 1971 to the Viking spacecraft in 1975, a whole new picture of the planet began to unfold. Gigantic canyons, monstrous volcanoes, even small channels, which might have been caused by rain.
So the possibility then existed that sometime in the ancient past on Mars, there may have been liquid water on the surface. So that then opened the possibility that there may once have been life, and if there was once life, maybe it was preserved in some places.
Today, it's agreed there is no intelligent life on Mars. But if not on Mars, somewhere else. For several years, NASA operated a program called SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, with massive radio telescopes scanning deep space frequencies in hopes of finding manufactured signals. Now, private money continues the effort. But what would those intelligences be like if we found them? Or if they found us? Science fiction people have imagined some pretty wild alternatives. Fascination with the idea of extraterrestrial life persists. Aliens have been a popular, if not always deadly serious, theme in movies and television, and they have featured some of the most popular characters of all time.
Captain, the Horde is a remarkably intelligent and sensitive creature.
Like the more or less friendly Vulcan who arrived aboard Star Trek back in the 1960s.
I suspect you're becoming more and more human all the time.
Captain, I see no reason to stand here and be insulted.
Leonard Nimoy actually began his extraterrestrial career in the 1950s.
Perhaps a little longer. The atmosphere on Mars is so thin we've adapted ourselves to live on very little oxygen.
My first work as an alien was, I believe, 1951, over 40 years ago, in what was known as a Saturday serial. It was in a piece called Zombies of the Stratosphere, in which I played one of 3 or 4 Martians who arrived on Earth in a wobbly silver cigar-shaped spaceship that landed behind a rock, because then they didn't have to show the whole ship. And we got off of this ship carrying weapons that looked to me like 38 caliber revolvers. And we hijacked a pickup truck, and we were going to take over planet Earth.
As both actor and director, Leonard Nimoy has done a lot to popularize the idea of space exploration. He also has some thoughts about the psychological roots of this alien thing.
There was a movie in which I had a very small role in, I think, the early 50s called Them, also about alien creatures. In this case, they were mutations. They were ants that had mutated into these giant creatures. But I thought the title was perfectly appropriate to cover this entire canvas. Them. It's us, and there's them. And them is the other. It's people of different color, people of different attitude, people of different social structure, people with different values than we have.
Some say we have a deep-seated need for aliens. After all, what's an us without a them? But Wells saw his Martians in starker terms, as perhaps man's fate, if man is not very smart, or lucky, or both. As the hero continues his journey, he sees that the Martians have shifted from the use of heat rays to a form of poison gas, which at least preserves the architecture. And something is happening to the red weed. It seems to be dying, probably from a mold or some other plant pest. Now, as he makes his way deeper into the city of London,
It was as if that mighty desert of houses had found a voice for its fear and solitude. I turned northwards, marveling toward the iron gates of Hyde Park. I had half a mind to break into the Natural History Museum and make my way up to the summits of the towers in order to see across the park, but I decided to keep to the ground.
he comes upon Regent's Park, and there it is.
I was not terrified. I came upon him as if it were a matter of course. I watched him for some time, but he did not move.
A second monster lies by the zoological gardens. The hero continues walking, with some purpose now, past the park.
While that voice sounded, the solitude, the desolation had been endurable. By virtue of it, London had still seemed alive, and the sense of life about me had upheld me. Then suddenly a change. the passing of something, I knew not what, and then a stillness that could be felt. Nothing but this gaunt quiet.
Moving on, he finally sees the curve of Primrose Hill, and on its crest, a third Martian.
The Martians were dead, slain by the putrefactive and disease bacteria against which their systems were unprepared, slain as the red weed was being slain, slain after all man's devices had failed.
Where it's not the Earthlings who defeat the Martians, it's the minute and almost invisible bacteria. What a coup de théâtre! Who wrote such a marvellous ending to a novel as that? It's wonderful, isn't it?
Millions of readers have agreed. But there is more to this book than a wonderful story. Behind it was Wells's continuing fear that humankind would annihilate itself before it learned how to preserve itself. A subject about which he had uncanny foresight. In 1934, a young physicist named Leo Szilard was contemplating the idea of atomic chain reaction. Knowing what this would mean, Szilard said years later, and I knew because I had read H.G. Wells, I did not want this patent to become public. In 1913, Wells already had imagined just such a chain reaction, an atomic bomb. And 32 years later, that frightful prediction came true, obliterating the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The writer died a few months later. The character of H.G. Wells is the subject of continuing debate, but his importance as a writer and a thinker is not. The New York Times called him the greatest public teacher of his time, and the durability of his stature is conceded even by his bitterest critic today.
Don't be put off because he was a bad man and he wrote things that can be very damaging. He was also one of the finest writers of the century. The War of the Worlds is a book of consummate standing. Wells was without any doubt a great writer. I think he will be seen as one of the greats. I say one of the 20 greats in the English language.
The struggle between good and evil in mankind. Glorious future versus none at all. Such are the elements that do battle in a little book published almost a century ago by an enigmatic, contradictory man at war with himself, but a man whose vision embraced the future of the human race.
And when the slow cooling of the sun makes this earth uninhabitable, as at last it must do, it may be that the thread of life that has begun here will have streamed out and caught our sister planet in its toils. Dim and wonderful is the vision I have conjured up in my mind of life spreading slowly from this little seedbed of the solar system throughout the inanimate vastness of sidereal space. But that is a remote dream. It may be, on the other hand, that the destruction of the Martians is only a reprieve. To them, and not to us, perhaps, is the future ordained.